Look at your hands right now. Feel the chair beneath you. Press your fingertips against the nearest surface and pay close attention to that sensation of resistance pushing back. Now prepare yourself, because what I am about to tell you will permanently change the way you experience every single physical moment of your life. You have never touched anything, not once, not ever. Every embrace you have given, every object you have held, every texture you have felt from the first moment you entered this world is a flawless, calculated illusion constructed by your nervous system to hide the true and deeply unsettling quantum nature of reality. Follow the logic carefully. You are made of atoms. The world surrounding you is made of atoms, but an atom is 99.9% completely empty space. So what actually happens when you press your finger against what appears to be a solid wooden table? The clouds of electrons wrapping the atoms in your finger approach the electron clouds of the table. And because identical electrical charges repel each other with absolute ferocity, those invisible fields push violently against one another. The resistance you feel against your skin is not matter colliding with matter. It is pure electromagnetic repulsion. At this precise moment, you are levitating a microscopic fraction of a millimeter above your seat. You are floating above the ground. You have never made genuine physical contact with the material universe. This is not a philosophical exercise or a poetic metaphor. It is the most rigorously confirmed physical truth in the history of science. And yet our brains hide it from us so completely that even people who study physics professionally must remind themselves of it deliberately. The reason this concealment is so perfect begins with the way we have been taught to picture matter itself. The science we learned in school handed us a convenient lie. We were shown atoms as tiny solar systems, with electrons orbiting a dense central nucleus like miniature moons circling a planet. That image is a simplification so extreme it borders on fiction. A real electron is not a small solid sphere tracing a predictable path. It is a probability cloud, a ghostly smear of negative energy that surrounds the nucleus without ever occupying one fixed location. It is defined not by position but by likelihood, a quantum fog that can only be described mathematically. And the scale of emptiness inside that fog is genuinely terrifying once you sit with it honestly. If a single atom were enlarged to the size of the largest cathedral you could imagine, its nucleus, which contains almost all of the atom's mass, would be the size of a single housefly buzzing alone at the center of that immense space. Everything else from wall to wall, floor to vaulted ceiling, would be pure empty space inhabited only by that ghostly electron fog. Nothing else. No solid floor, no furniture, no structure of any kind. Now look at yourself again. Your body is an astronomical collection of these vast inner emptinesses. You are a ghost assembled almost entirely from absolute nothingness. And the world you move through every day is equally hollow. The concrete wall in front of you is mostly vacuum. The ground beneath your feet is mostly vacuum. So the question that should be burning in your mind right now is obvious and urgent. If you and everything around you are almost entirely empty space, why does anything feel solid at all? Why does your hand stop at the table instead of passing straight through it like light through fog? The answer is not solidity. There is no such thing as solidity in the way your brain imagines it. The answer is electromagnetic force combined with one of the most absolute rules quantum mechanics has ever produced. Together, they create an invisible barrier so powerful and so consistent that your nervous system has spent your entire life mistaking it for the feeling of something solid beneath your fingers. Electrons carry a negative electrical charge, and the universe enforces one rule about electrical charges with zero exceptions. Opposite charges attract each other. Identical charges repel each other with relentless intensity. When you press your hand toward any surface, you are driving your own electron clouds toward the electron clouds of that surface. And before the nuclei of your atoms come anywhere remotely close to the nuclei of the material you are pressing against, those probability fogs collide invisibly. Your electrons and the surface's electrons push against each other with a mathematical intensity that requires massive force to overcome. But something even deeper is operating beneath this electromagnetic repulsion. A quantum rule so fundamental it shapes the entire structure of matter as we know it. It is called the Pauli exclusion principle. This law states that particles like electrons categorically refuse to occupy the same quantum state in the same space at the same time. It is a universal traffic barrier with no override function, no amount of force, no clever engineering, no extreme condition anywhere in the normal universe can make two electrons share the same state and position simultaneously. So when your hand approaches a surface, what you experience as resistance is the combined effect of electromagnetic repulsion and quantum exclusion acting together at a scale billions of times smaller than anything you can see. Your nervous system does not report this to your brain as invisible field interactions. It translates the signal into something your conscious mind can use The electromagnetic field of the surface compresses the cell membranes in your fingertip ever so slightly. That compression triggers an electrical signal. That signal travels up your arm, through your spinal cord, and arrives in your brain. And there, in the complete darkness and silence inside your skull, your mind invents the sensation of touch. Your brain is lying to you, not out of malice, but out of evolutionary necessity. A brain that reported raw quantum field interactions instead of simplified tactile sensations would be useless for survival. You need to know that fire burns and that ice is cold and that the ground is stable enough to walk on. You do not need to know, for purposes of surviving long enough to reproduce, that you are perpetually separated from everything by electromagnetic fields operating in near total emptiness. So the brain simplifies. It invents a story. And the story it tells is so convincing, so immediate, so physically vivid, that we have spent most of human history believing it completely. Now that this foundation is in place, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the barrier preventing genuine contact is electromagnetic, what happens when you apply enough force to overcome it? What happens at the extreme limits of physical compression, where the most powerful forces in the universe are pushing matter together with everything they have? Does matter ever truly touch? The answer to that question leads somewhere far stranger and far more disturbing than anything we have covered so far, into territory where the two greatest physical theories ever developed by human civilization collide head-on and destroy each other. Your muscles cannot overcome the electromagnetic repulsion of a concrete wall. The force your body generates is insufficient to push electron clouds through each other, which is why your hand stops and hurts when you strike a hard surface. But the universe contains forces incomparably more powerful than human muscle. What happens when we apply them? What happens when gravity on the scale of a dying massive star begins crushing matter together with everything it has? When a sufficiently massive star exhausts its nuclear fuel and collapses, gravity begins compressing the atoms of its core with force that dwarfs anything achievable on Earth. The electromagnetic repulsion we discussed fights back hard. Electron clouds resist being compressed. But if the dead star's mass exceeds a certain threshold, gravity wins the initial battle. The space between atomic nuclei shrinks toward almost nothing, but quantum mechanics refuses to surrender quietly. The Pauli exclusion principle reasserts itself in a different form. When electrons are forced into an increasingly small space, they begin moving at significant fractions of the speed of light, not because they have been pushed to those speeds, but because the only way they can avoid sharing the same quantum state while confined so tightly is to move with extreme velocity. This frantic quantum motion generates an outward pressure called electron degeneracy pressure. It is the force that holds white dwarf stars stable against gravitational collapse. It is a desperate quantum scream against physical contact. But suppose you add more mass, more gravity. If the compressing star crosses a precise mathematical threshold known as the Chandrasekhar limit, electron degeneracy pressure finally breaks. Gravity overwhelms it. In a catastrophic implosion, electrons are driven into protons and fuse with them. The vast inner emptiness of every atom disappears. What remains is an incomprehensibly dense sphere of neutrons packed together, a neutron star. A single teaspoon of this material would weigh billions of tons on Earth. Have we achieved genuine physical contact at last? Are the neutrons in a neutron star actually touching each other? The universe answers this with something that looks uncomfortably like amusement. A neutron is not a solid marble. It is composed of still smaller fundamental particles called quarks, held together by the strong nuclear force. When you attempt to push two neutrons closer than a minimum separation, that same nuclear force that binds quarks together reverses direction and becomes a repulsive spring of extraordinary power. The neutrons still do not touch in any classical sense. They are still separated by quantum force fields. So with absolute stubbornness, we push further. We collapse the neutron star. We add more mass until gravity becomes overwhelming. We break the strong nuclear force. We create a black hole. And here, the structure of our understanding of reality breaks down completely. Because according to Einstein's general relativity, all the compressed matter collapses inevitably into a mathematical point of infinite density and zero volume at the center of the black hole. A singularity. If volume is zero, then by definition all the matter is finally touching. Distance has ceased to exist. But quantum mechanics, the other unbreakable pillar of physics, prohibits anything from occupying zero space. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle demands that particles have room to fluctuate, that position can never be infinitely precise. In quantum mechanics, absolute zero volume is mathematically illegal. The two most successful and most precisely tested theories in all of human science, when forced to answer what happens when you push matter until it touches, directly contradict each other. They cannot both be right. They cannot coexist at the singularity. The framework of reality tears itself apart in the equations. When physical equations produce infinity as an answer, physicists do not celebrate a great discovery. Infinity appearing in a calculation is the universe's way of announcing that the theory producing it is fundamentally incomplete. It is a red warning signal written in mathematical language. And the contradiction between general relativity and quantum mechanics at the singularity of a black hole is the most severe such warning in the history of physics. To begin resolving this crisis, we have to stop focusing exclusively on matter and start examining something we have been treating as a passive background this entire time: the space between things. The stage on which all of this compression and repulsion and collapse has been playing out. Because the assumption that space is smooth, continuous, and infinitely divisible turns out to be just as false as the assumption that matter is solid. Your intuition insists that you can take any distance and cut it in half. Then cut that half in half again, then again, and again, forever. There is no reason in ordinary experience to doubt this. Distance feels infinitely divisible because at every scale we can directly observe, smaller measurements are always possible. But the geometry of theoretical physics, built from the same mathematical foundations that produce quantum mechanics and general relativity, leads to a conclusion that flatly contradicts this intuition. The universe is pixelated. Space is not a smooth continuous fabric. It has a minimum unit, a smallest possible length below which the concept of distance loses all physical meaning. In physics, this is called the Planck length. To grasp its scale, consider this. If a single atom were expanded until it equaled the size of the entire observable universe, the Planck length within that expanded atom would be approximately the size of a single average human being. It is a number written as a decimal point followed by 34 zeros before reaching a 1 measured in meters. At this extreme scale, space and time, as we experience them, stop functioning. The familiar dimensions of left, right, forward, back, up, down dissolve entirely. The smooth canvas of reality begins foaming with fluctuating quantum geometry. It is not a stable background against which events occur. It is itself a turbulent probabilistic process, a boiling ocean of microscopic space-time uncertainties with no clear structure below the Planck scale. Think of the screen you are reading this on. From normal viewing distance, it appears as a perfectly smooth, continuous image. But examined closely with sufficient magnification, it reveals itself as a rigid grid of discrete light-emitting blocks. There is nothing between those blocks. You cannot illuminate half a pixel, because a pixel is the absolute resolution limit of that display. The space-time of our universe operates on the same principle. There is a resolution limit, a minimum pixel, and below the Planck length, the question of what exists simply becomes unanswerable. Not because we lack instruments precise enough to look, but because the geometry that would contain anything smaller does not exist. This single fact destroys the possibility of true physical contact at a completely different level from the electromagnetic argument. Contact in the classical sense requires closing the gap between two objects all the way to zero. But if space has a minimum unit, if the universe has a resolution limit, then zero distance is not a location that exists within the geometric structure of reality. You cannot compress two things to a separation smaller than one Planck length because there is no geometric space below that threshold to compress them into. The universe does not merely resist contact through force. It prohibits contact through the fundamental architecture of space itself. If a space is a pixelated grid rather than a smooth continuum, a deeper and more disturbing question immediately presents itself. What holds those pixels together? If the basic fabric of reality is fragmented at its foundation into trillions upon trillions of discrete geometric blocks, what prevents the entire universe, including you, from simply flying apart into disconnected cosmic dust? What is the glue of existence if space itself is not a continuous medium? The answer comes from the strangest confirmed phenomenon in all of modern physics. A discovery so thoroughly tested in laboratories around the world that its reality is beyond scientific dispute, yet so completely alien to everyday intuition that even physicists who work with it daily describe it as deeply unsettling. It is quantum entanglement, and it is nothing like the version portrayed in science fiction. When two particles interact in a specific way, their quantum properties become mathematically linked regardless of the physical distance separating them afterward. Send one of those entangled particles to the opposite side of the galaxy, 100,000 light years away, with nothing whatsoever connecting it to its partner. No cable, no electromagnetic signal, no information channel of any kind. Then measure a property of the particle you kept here on Earth, forcing it to settle into one definite quantum state. At the precise instant that measurement occurs, the distant particle assumes the corresponding opposite state instantaneously. not after a delay for a signal to travel at the speed of light, not with any measurable lag at all, simultaneously across the full span of that separation. Einstein despised this. He called it spooky action at a distance because it appeared to violate the absolute speed limit of light he had spent his career establishing. He spent years attempting to demonstrate that it was an illusion produced by hidden variables, information carried locally that made the apparent simultaneity a measurement artifact rather than a real phenomenon. Experiments following the rigorous standards of modern physics have repeatedly confirmed that Einstein was wrong on this specific point. The universe genuinely does this. Entanglement is not a theoretical debate. It is a measured, reproducible, experimentally verified fact about how reality behaves. Now consider what entanglement implies when combined with the pixelated structure of space. We have been assuming throughout this discussion that space is the container and particles are the objects inside it. The container is primary and the objects are secondary. But the mathematics of quantum gravity and the geometric structures underlying the most advanced theoretical framework suggest something far more radical. Space is not the container. Space is the output. The spatial distances we perceive and measure are not a pre-existing stage on which quantum events occur. They are produced by quantum entanglement itself. Those minimum Planck length blocks of geometry are not floating inside a pre-existing space. They generate the appearance of space through their quantum connections with each other. The more strongly two regions are entangled, the closer together they appear in the spatial picture we experience. The weaker the entanglement between two regions, the greater the apparent distance between them. What you perceive as physical separation between yourself and any object around you is not the measurement of a gap in a container. It is a measure of how weakly entangled two regions of the underlying quantum information network happen to be. Your brain is performing a double deception every time you perceive anything as solid or distant. First, it invents solidity by translating electromagnetic repulsion into the sensation of a hard surface. Second, it invents distance by treating the quantum information network as if it were a smooth, three-dimensional space with separate objects positioned apart from one another. Neither interpretation reflects what is actually happening at the foundational level of physical reality. Bring your hand close to any nearby surface and hold it there. Look at the gap between your skin and that material. What you are observing is not two separate objects separated by empty space in any classical sense. You are observing two regions of the same underlying quantum information network, regions that happen to be weakly entangled with each other and therefore appear spatially distant within the perceptual model your brain generates. The separation is real as a description of entanglement strength. It is not real as a description of two genuinely isolated things meeting across a passive void. This is where the deepest implications of everything covered in this discussion converge into a single conclusion. You cannot touch the table because your electron clouds repel the table's electron clouds with electromagnetic force before genuine nuclear proximity is achieved. You cannot touch the table because space itself is pixelated into minimum Planck length units that make zero distance a geometric impossibility. And at the most fundamental level, you cannot touch the table because the idea that you and the table are genuinely separate entities attempting to cross a spatial gap is itself a biological fiction. At the quantum geometric foundation of reality, your body and every object around you are not isolated structures drifting through passive three-dimensional space. You are all disturbances in the same entangled network of information. Your atoms and the atoms of the world share quantum connections threading through the underlying geometry of space-time. The apparent physical separation between you and everything you have ever tried to touch is a perceptual interface your nervous system built for evolutionary survival, not a description of what is actually occurring at the level of fundamental physics. This brings us to the final and most unsettling question of all. If the sensation of touch is constructed by your brain from electromagnetic signals that never involve genuine contact, and if your brain itself is a physical organ made of the same quantum matter we have been discussing, then what is generating the subjective experience of feeling anything at all? How does a mass of biological tissue sealed in darkness inside your skull produce the vivid, immediate, undeniably real feeling of sensation? The quantum processes occurring inside the structural components of neurons, operating at scales where quantum effects become relevant, may be doing something that classical biological computing alone cannot account for. When quantum states maintained in these structures reach a critical threshold of geometric tension, they collapse into definite classical states. And there is a serious scientific argument, grounded in the mathematics of quantum gravity, that this orchestrated collapse of quantum probability into definite reality is precisely what conscious experience is. Your perception of touching something is the collapse of countless probability waves inside your mind, translating the invisible electromagnetic reality of the external world into the rich, textured, completely convincing illusion you call physical sensation. Every surface you have ever pressed your hand against. Every person whose hand you have ever held. Every texture, temperature, and resistance you have ever felt. All of it has been your mind constructing a usable story from fields of invisible force operating in a space that is itself an emergent property of quantum entanglement. The universe has never allowed genuine physical contact to occur anywhere within its structure. It has instead built a system of representation so precise, so consistent, and so immediately convincing that biological creatures navigating it have had no reason to question it across the entire span of their existence. You are not moving through the universe as a separate object traversing empty space. You are a localized region of the universe interacting with itself. The next time you reach out and feel resistance beneath your fingers, remember that you are not touching the world. You are the world, briefly aware of its own geometry, mistaking the boundary of a force field for the edge of something solid, in a cosmos where solidity was never more than the most beautiful and elaborate deception ever constructed by the laws of physics. If this permanently changed the way you experience physical reality, share it with someone whose perception deserves to be challenged. Subscribe to keep dismantling the comfortable illusions between you and the true structure of the cosmos, because the universe is stranger than any story we have told ourselves about it, and the truth is worth every moment of discomfort it takes to face it clearly.